Hello, class. The lecture is on Frank Miller's 300. He is the author and writer of this graphic novel. Lynn Varley at the time was his wife. She is the colorist, meaning that, of course, he draws everything, she puts the color in. All right, and that is actually far more important for this comic book than you may realize. So, one thing you absolutely have to understand about this comic book is that the color palette is extremely symbolic. And it goes beyond, very simple things like, oh, red means passion and blue is loyalty. It goes beyond that. Um, Basically, the Persians and the Spartans are divided up and represented by either Apollonian, meaning the god Apollo, Apollonian philosophy, or Dionysian philosophy, meaning the god Dionysus, which represent, they both represent different things. And, each group, has characteristics of both, but primarily the Spartans, are represented by Apollo, which is why a lot of the colors associated with the Spartans are reds, oranges, yellows, that have to do with, the sun. And, red has to do with nationalism. And, and Apollo as well. And the characteristics that are associated with Apollonian philosophy are, logic over reason, rationality, especially. And, a distrust of superstition and the old ways in favor of new ideas that humans are, coming up with their intellect, ideas of democracy and things like that. Okay. So on the other hand, you have Dionysian philosophy, which is all about the emotion, the instinct over the intellect. It's about the blues and the blacks and the silvers and those kind of colors are going to be associated with Dionysian philosophy. And, it leans heavily on superstition and the old ways and tradition and the gods and the supernatural and all of that kind of stuff. And those are going to be represented, by the immortals, the Persians, the Ephors. You're going to see a lot of that. Although there is some overlaps. But you can't understand the color palette unless you understand those two things. Now, you also have this tan that makes its way through through here in bronze and gold as well. And you have two different kinds of golds. You have the sun gold and the bronze gold of the Spartans on their shields, and then you have the money gold of the Persians that's used to corrupt the Ephors. So you've got some stuff that's shared, but also the tan that exists within the Spartans, is representative of loyalty and conformity and normality and the earth of Greece itself, which is why the book's going to begin that way. Anyway, so I wanted to get that out there before we start talking about the comic book. Now, this isn't, of course, historically accurate. The Spartans would normally be dressed head to toe in scale mail armor that weighed about 180 pounds. As you can see here from the cover, and I'm going to move on. You're not going to be staring at this image. But as you can see here from the cover, we have a helmet only. And this is going to put forth the idea that the Spartans were not individuals, but they are Spartan. That is their identity. It's like in Dionysian philosophy, it is the individual that's more important than the group. But in Apollonian philosophy, it's all about what can the individual do for the group. So the group is more important, society, civilization, that type of thing. Okay. So, already you can see the tans that we're going to get associated with the Spartans in Greece and the helmet itself. You already got blood splatter, so it's going to be violent. You've already got, the blues in the background and the black represent the Persians. So we're already seeing some of this early stuff here. All right. So inside the cover, you can already see the tan, the idea of Mother Earth, Mother Greece itself being represented. All right. The blue, the Spartan invasion. Okay, we just got our basic page here. As you can see, a lot of students mistake it and think that Lynn Varley is the artist. She's the colorist. Frank Miller is the artist and storyteller. All right. Okay. So each of these things, these chapters, we don't have page numbers, right? So, it's a little funny when you write an essay about this beside anything, it's a little tricky. But each of these chapters, have a title that, of course, is tied up to the theme of the chapter. And as you can see here, you can't really tell the Spartans apart. Now, like I said before, normally Spartans would be covered in about 160 or 180 pounds of scale mail, about what our Rangers and modern day armies carry in their packs in terms of weight. But you notice we already have the theme of uniformity. I mean, you can barely tell anybody apart. We don't see any faces, no individuality. But Frank Miller chose to have the Spartans almost naked to kind of tie in that idea of the superhero, like they're even more than human. So one of the themes of this is the idea of hypermasculinity. And because, the Spartans were the elite ground fighting force on the planet at the time of their existence. Nobody could beat them. They were just, amazing. They had these shield wall tactics and all of these things. Anyways, so as you can see, they're not going to be, oftentimes the Spartans are naked, except for that, the shin guards and, and the capes and the helmets. Most times they're naked. They're not even wearing like their thong underwear. And that again is to stress the idea of their hypermasculinity. Look how comfortable they are in their masculine, bodies. They can just walk around, things flying and hanging and dangling everywhere. You know what I mean? And he gave them the cape again to give them that kind of superhero type outfit. And again, we have the tan of Greece, as you'll notice, and it almost matches their skin. So a lot of themes already there, All right. So one thing that I wanted to point out here, there we go, is again that tan in the background. We already have the gray, the black, alluding to the idea of death. Again, look, there's like no real individuals. They all kind of blend together. You can't hardly tell them apart. Kind of ambiguous of race or nationality. They're all just kind of like tan, Mediterranean looking. But what I wanted to point out was you have in the military what's called rapport talking. And what rapport talking came from is it's the idea that at one point, generally in our evolution, males are out hunting and fighting, which required them to say very little and a packet full of meaning. So you didn't draw attention to yourself by talking. You could communicate things quickly in battle. And so that's what we have here in terms of syntax. Very short, powerful, small sentences, small words, not even always grammatically correct, sometimes fragments. And we also have, another idea here. And you may not realize it yet, but you're already in a story within a story. So right when you open the book for the first time, you don't realize it, but you're being told a story, and that's not revealed until the very last page of the book. So right now we're in a story within a story. The overarching story that exists without your knowledge yet, I'm going to call the final battle, or the Battle of Plataea. And Plataea, sorry. And that's where the Spartans finally defeat the Persians like 3 years after King Leonidas dies. So we're in that story right now, and that's where the book's going to end, but you don't realize it yet, right? So now we're within our first story within a story, which I'll call We March. And it's in the present tense, although it's being told, in the past, we find out later on the last page. So it's interesting to kind of speculate at what point, who exactly is the narrator? Does that narration, remain, consistent? Right now, Dilios, who's missing an eye, is the one, telling the story. And he is the storyteller in the book, but sometimes he's not present when the story's told. So it's kind of like it drifts in and out of like an omniscient narrator. That may be him taking poetic license. But this story is floats back and forth between present and past tense, and it's kind of interesting. But also, one of the things you have to realize is this comic book is very complex because it also adheres to many of the Greek epic story traditions. You know, we have descriptions of arms and armor. We don't have an invocation to the muse, but we have heroes and villains that are larger than life, like Leonidas. And by larger than life, I mean, almost unreal, that they can't be real. They're so almost unreal. One of the Greek epic, you have to have a giant battle in Greek epic storytelling, and usually have a journey far away from home, and some side stories in there too. Well, these guys, they don't go far away from home for the battle, just like 10 days march or whatever, or 3 days march or whatever. But you do have that idea of them being separate than their wives, and there are other little side stories in here as well, which is a part of Greek storytelling as well. And you also have the idea of the supernatural, which is in that storytelling tradition. We have hints of it here. The Spartans, there's like an oracle and stuff, so we can check that box. So there's a lot of elements there, and you'll see them without. But I really like this complex structure, and I like the tone it sets. These short sentences: "We march," from here to Laconia, from sacred Sparta, we march, and it already establishes that kind of hyper masculine theme. And ladies, don't worry, we're going to get some stuff that's not so hyper masculine later. So you can see this for honor's sake. You can see the lack of individuality here. I mean, you can see how many of them are naked or walking without even their underwear. But one interesting way that this comic book is drawn is that you have these huge bleeding panels in the back that are gutterless, that go right off the page, and then you have these other mini panels in here to show you some of the action and the story. And this is, of course, a great example of the hypermasculinity. They're walking in 90-something degree weather, dehydrated, and the guy gets dizzy and falls down, and his punishment would normally be that he would be beaten to death. But because this is the only 300 that Leonidas has, he just gets off of the beating and then has to carry his drill sergeant, who doesn't stop when Leonidas tells him to, or his captain, I'm sorry, and gets knocked out, and then the whole company gets punished as one. Nobody gets to have food or water until they stop for the day. Again, this is that military state aspect of the Spartans. They were a military state. The kids at a young age, around age 7, were put in what's called the Eubilgi, which is a training academy where they're taught, basically it's like ROTC on steroids, except for, not all the kids survive. They force them in situations where they have to be resourceful and use stealth to steal food from the adult Spartans in order to survive. They beat each other up for food, and then they're taught to work as a unit later once they kind of separate the weak. The Spartans did eliminate, babies at birth that weren't, there. But, this book does bend history a little bit. The Spartans did own slaves, and here they're like, all, no, slavery, democracy, so kind of, Frank Miller's trying to kind of glorify the legend here, not necessarily be historically accurate. But if I wanted to point out something else, if you look at the bottom of the page, you're thinking about like art analysis. You see the yellows and and the oranges and the golds that are already being associated, the sun, democracy, Apollo, reason, logic, freedom, they're being associated here with the Spartans. But even if you look at the bottom of the page and you see Leonidas's beard right to the right of where it says "Wonk," we wonder if Stelios will die. He has that beard that's pointed, and his nose is pointed. It almost looks like, he is a weapon. And if you look at the way the Spartans are drawn, they're all drawn, extremely with sharp edges, sharp lines to accentuate the point that these guys, that's all they are, is weapons. Their identity is soldier. Their identity is spear. And so the art, symbolizes that and the masculinity as well. Okay, so here we are in our We March story, and Stelios starts telling the story of the wolf and Leonidas as a boy. So right now we're in our third storyline. So we've got the story that you don't know you're in yet, which is Stelios telling this at the Battle of Plataea. And then we've got, the We March storyline, which we think is the regular present tense storyline. And now we're going back into a third storyline, which is this wolf thing. Now, this wolf thing here is extremely important metaphorically to the entire book. The tactics that Leonidas uses here against the wolf is going to be the tactics that he and his 300 Spartans and, several thousand Phoenicians, Arcadians, all these things use against, the Persians. Now, historically, there were actually several thousand Spartans when this thing starts off, and some split off and kind of go in different directions, here or there. But historically, there is Leonidas's 300 Spartans, but he also has, you got to realize there's other battles going on in other places. All over the place right now, all over Greece and all over the Mediterranean. I mean, it's a huge invasion. But we start off with Leonidas' 300 Spartans, and then he has a few thousand Phoenicians, a few thousand Arcadians, Thespians, all these other guys, that are with him kind of want to march, all together with Sparta. So, like I said, it's not quite 100% accurate, but it's close. They think that the Persian forces numbered somewhere between, some people say 125,000, some people say 500,000. Most historians put it around 150 to 225,000 versus the 300 Spartans and about 11 to 17,000 other Greeks. So it was like a huge force against a small force. For sure. Okay, so the story of the boy here, I just want you to notice the color palette. So as you can see, this is before Leonidas is a Spartan. He is, in his tests, so, he's in his testing phase, his trial, where he's a spy in the wild, and he faces a direwolf. You may be familiar with direwolves from Game of Thrones. What you might not know is they were real. The last direwolves that we know in America were killed out around like 15 to 20,000 years ago, but direwolves were real. They stood about 6 foot tall at the back, and that's what we have here representing a much larger Persian army. Notice you have the black of the direwolf and the silvers and blues that we associate with the Persians and Dionysian philosophy, instinct, emotion, right, like in the wolf. And Leonidas here, tan representing Greece. He's a Greek. Lures the wolf into a choke point using logic and reason. So we have, again, this idea of Apollonian philosophy versus Dionysian, logic versus emotion. And this central image here you see at the bottom of this choke point is going to be repeated several times, throughout this thing. And got a little funny, he gave him his backside thing there too as the story's being told. So you see the Spartans over here on the left, they're around the fire. You've got that, again, reference to the sun, fire, again, the oranges and stuff. And of course, Leonidas is victorious, just as the Spartans, put a whooping on the Persians using the same tactic. All right. Okay, so Leonidas returns. That's a really cool scene from the movie. I believe I have it attached to your D2L. Okay. Now I want you to notice that this speech here at the bottom that starts with "It has been more than 40 years since the wolf," that whole no fear, restlessness, heightened sense of things. That's a point where the narration is also repeated, as is this metaphor of the wolf. So you're going to see that again several times throughout the comic. All right, again, if you'll notice, Spartans just laying around naked, not a care in the world, All right. Yeah. Okay, so again, we have dropped back into another story here. As Dilios says, it was Leonidas that first provoked it. We're going back in time yet again to before the We March storyline. Okay, so now we're in our fourth storyline, which I call the provocation storyline, because this is when, Leonidas provokes Xerxes even more. I mean, it's kind of a stupid point they make that, he provoked him by doing this. Clearly, the Persian invasion was coming no matter what he did here, so you might as well send him a message of strength, in my opinion. But what I want you to notice in these scenes is, the differences between the Spartans and the Persians. The Persians here are adorned with gold rings and fancy clothes and fancy matching uniforms, and they look very fancy. And, the Spartans are kind of laid back. They're not adorned with jewelry or anything like that. This captain here, or whoever this, negotiator is, that's coming for the with the Persians, has very fancy jewelry and all this stuff. And even King Leonidas, as king of the Spartans, does not. You can also look at the differences between their diction, the way they speak, the false words of this negotiator versus the very direct words of the Spartans. I like the side-by-side comparison there that they give you. They want you to compare the Spartans and the Persians together, And again, Leonidas is no different than, all these other guys. The Spartans are all naked. They only have this dusty, cape, again, representing Greece. Notice they still have weapons, even though they're naked, walking around, because, again, they are weapons. They are soldiers. And this flowery language that the Persians use is kind of interesting, because the Persians constantly tell them, "Let us use your reason. Let us use your reason." But the Persians really aren't trying to get them to use their reason. They're intimidating them through threats and violence and saying, "Use your reason," only because they know that the Greeks value reason and logic. It's actually, a lie, a deception, which again ties into the idea of Dionysian philosophy, using emotion rather than than logic, because negotiating with a conquering force, is a bunch of slave traders that has a slave army. What are you negotiating for? Slavery. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You're either going to fight and die, or you're going to choose to be a slave. So those are your choices. So they're not very direct, whereas Leonidas is. And again, you can see his face itself even looks like a blade. You also see Leonidas on that previous page. I'm sorry. You also see Leonidas on that previous page say that, even if those Athenians, the boy lovers, have said no to you, we Spartans have our reputation to think of. And, so they're, emasculating with insults, competitive tribes. The Athenians gave them a lot of trouble. So again, you have that idea of hypermasculinity. And this is a really great scene from the film as well. Okay, so you can see we have one of our major Dionysian elements here at the beginning of chapter 2, which is called duty. Not duty, but duty. And you have that idea of the moon very prominent. Now, that's no accident. You got to realize these comic book artists, every time they write or draw something, it takes time out of their lives. I mean, this time away from family and children, it takes psychic energy. It takes dedication. It takes, it's art, but it's work. So he didn't just arbitrarily choose this moon. It's very important, and it's important in terms of the battle between logic and emotion and superstition that goes on here. So if you notice on this page, it says that, it doesn't matter the fact that King Leonidas is king. He cannot go to war without consulting the ephors, which is the old superstitious aspect of the Spartans. So even the Spartans have a little bit of superstition. They're not all Apollonian. There's a little bit of crossover. And if you'll notice, the color palette starts to become mixed between that of Apollonian reds and yellows and tans with the the gold, the blue and the silver and the black of the night. And so he can't go to war, of course, without the E4s, which if you read this, you know. But what you really want to point out is look at the wording. If you're going to write an essay that analyzes, these Apollonian Dionysian, elements, he's thwarted. He's already defeated. He's thwarted by a foe, an enemy that squats amongst the summer clouds, ran round and fat as any gluttonous Athenian. And of course, he's talking about the moon because they can't go to war during the harvest moon as part of their superstition. You can see it looks a little bit like, this can almost be Frank Miller's Batman right there. But anyways, and it even affects King Leonidas. You can see the colors begin to mix. Even his cloak looks blue in this light. And so what you get in the E4s here is a battle. And it's a battle of color in terms of art on the page. And it's also a battle of philosophy. Leonidas is pushing forth the Apollonian. He's trying to tell them about the strategy, trying to funnel the Persians, how they'll all make us slaves, even if we won. And the Persians are trying to say, no. And he keeps telling them, he even says once, I would prefer you use your reason, rather than superstition. And they even tell him, your blasphemies have cost us enough, blah, blah, blah. And of course, the first thing they ask for him is gold, because it ends up these old corrupt ways are, these old superstitious ways are corrupt. These guys are all nasty with diseases and stuff. They take women, they molest them, and they force them to be oracles. And you can see even in the oracle, you have all the battle of color here, and it looks like, the blue and black of superstition is winning out. And of course, Leonidas is denied his ability to order the armies of the Spartans to attack. So, he can't go to war. And then, of course, you find out that very same, not the very same diplomat that got, kicked down the bridge, but another diplomat that is even more adorned in terms of gold in his face, has paid them off. So they are corrupt. And that's why there is so much black right there in those panels. All right. This is, interesting as well. You can see that, if you are just watching if you just tried to watch the movie to do this, you would find out that there's all kinds of stuff in the movie that never happened in this book. But one thing we do have is that tough queen of Leonidas's and all these politicians and people not wanting him to go. And, you still have that sparseness in words between them. There's no I love you, all that stuff. Right, so you still have that hardcore masculinity, hyper masculinity. Even within the women are very, very tough, very a lot of hard lines. This is one of my favorite scenes from the movie, and I think the movie, expresses it a little bit more. But what you can do here is also start to compare the way the Arcadians are drawn versus the Spartans. The Spartans are way more masculine, whereas a lot of the Arcadians have like dad bods and stuff. And, all of the Arcadians look very different, where the Spartans are very uniform. The Arcadians have their weapons in different places. And the Spartans, of course, here beat them in a battle of words. But they're all allies. They all work together. So, tra-la-la. But you can see what I'm saying on this page, where all the Arcadians, they're just guys who jump up, weekend warriors, where the Spartans, for their professions, are, are warriors all the time. And here we go. Now they're at the hot gates where the stuff's going to go down. So you can see that same, kind of funnel on the left there. When we were showing the story of the boar and the wolf, we got the overhead perspective. Now we're looking horizontally at it from a different perspective. But it's interesting that shape is showing back up. So like I said, even with the Spartans, you get some superstition. And here we have, the Spartans talking about Poseidon and Zeus helping them out. And, the Aegean Sea is very violent during times of years and during certain times of year. And a lot of the Persian army did get wiped out by this freak storm. The Greeks knew, which little bays they could tuck into to get away from it. And then you had the huge sea battle up there, which is the sequel to the movie 300, goes into that. But that's all going on at the same place here. And I just wanted you to note the color change. It gets like talk of superstition and the gods, and all of a sudden the colors go that way and change to that Dionysian way as well. All right. Okay. So there's usually kind of a tradition also in Greek storytelling where you'll have a villain who is often misshapen and deformed. And we have that, tradition here. Like, for instance, if you've seen Clash of the Titans, you know what I'm talking about. But we also have that, that tradition here with Ephialtes, who was supposed to be thrown out at birth, but instead his mom and his dad kept him. And I just wanted to point out that, it's interesting, by keeping him, by not obeying Spartan law and getting rid of him as a deformed baby, it actually causes the downfall of Leonidas. And Leonidas has the chance to kill him, but instead shows mercy. And it's he who ends up betraying him and causing the downfall of Leonidas. So anyways, I just wanted to point that out. Ephialtes there. All right. All right, so again, we get another, now I think we're up to, our fifth story within a story. And we get the story of Spartan babies, how Spartan babies are inspected at birth and they're discarded. And at the same time, in the adjacent panels, we have, displays of Spartan hypermasculinity. There's guys even training, even before the battle, they're doing push-ups. They got guys standing behind them, kind of like Animal House. Thank you, sir. May I have another? And, making, do you like it? Yeah, this is great. Do more. Oh, I'm a manly. Type thing going on. All right. And we have a Persian ambassador. And Leonidas doesn't even bother to speak him. Again, you have that hyper military type feel here, with the Spartan greeting. You can see, again, the decadence of the Persian and all the gold and, all the gold and all that good stuff, all the dark colors. Again, we've got the shading happening at night. We're talking about the Persians. So here they come. The battle here between colors, the battles of the Spartans and the Persians. And we get an interesting story within a story, which I think we're up to like number 6 or 7 now. Gotta lose count. But this is an interesting story, and it comes in the chapter Duty. And as you know, the story is about how the Spartans their strength is all about knowing not only what to do, but doing it. And this is talking about all of Greece here. So what happens historically is when King Leonidas dies and buys the Greek, all the different warring states of Greece, little mini city-states, time enough to prepare for the Persians, it actually unifies them when they hear that the king Leonidas dies, because the Spartans were so famous, that they were like, wow, So, that gives time, that inspires the Greeks to all come together and fight as one, and they start to move towards becoming a whole nation rather than warring city-states, out of survival, but also out of inspiration because of the Spartans. That happens historically. So that's what this story here is a metaphor for. That was awkward, metaphor for. The idea of the Spartans knowing not only what should be done, but doing it. And a lot of the other Greek nations they didn't want to go to war with the Persians. They were even thinking about surrendering. So that's the metaphor we have here. The Spartans are out there sacrificing themselves. They know what to do. That's a great scene in the film as well. Again, we have all these threats and all this good stuff. Okay, so here's where Ephialtes tries to convince Leonidas again. Leonidas spares him. Leonidas explains to him why he can't be a Spartan again. It's about uniformity. The way that, I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically, the way that warfare was fought at this time was mostly with spears and shields, and you had to be able to form what was called like a shield wall. And there were different kinds of shield walls. I mean, there was like a turtle shell formation, and like, interlocking. They even built shields that locked together and that had hinges on them, so you can make like a square. It was all kinds of crazy stuff. But Ephialtes can't, lift his shield high enough to help defend the guy next to him, to be part of the shield wall. So, one chink in it, the whole thing collapses, and then your forces are split in half. So Ephialtes basically, after Leonidas shows him mercy and tries to include him in what he can do, clearing bodies and fighting with the other guys, the Arcadians or whatever, Ephialtes, that ain't good enough for him, so he tries to commit suicide, which he fails at, as you'll see in a minute. All right, so finally, you get the words echoed again about the beast that's come, referencing back to the negotiator and to the wolf story. So that story is reasserting itself again. They talk about earthquakes, but it ends up, it's just, army formations, cavalry, the Persians coming again. All right, so we get some action here. All right. Again, if you'll notice, Leonidas looks like all the other Spartans. The only thing that separates him is, that the leadership thing to give the orders, the mohawk-looking horsehair thing on his head. All right, again, they're all the same identity. So chapter 4, combat, self-explanatory. Captain Obvious says, "You're welcome." Okay, and again, you got the militaristic short, short language. Notice the words that are often stressed in comics: locked, strike, join, fuse. All that uniformity, indivisible, impenetrable, unstoppable. All that idea of uniformity. That idea of the idea that the Spartans are one fighting force. And then we get, as you can see, this comic was used to storyboard the movie, and you can almost see there are direct parts of this comic book that are in the movie, almost the exact same way, and this is one of them. So if you'll notice in the background, again, the forces of Apollonian philosophy, logic, and reason are pushing them right off the cliff in front of the sun. Okay. The Persians loved, they had a lot of archers. That was one of their main battle tactics. But it talks about how they all have 100 different nations are descending upon the Spartans. It's the idea of many versus the idea of Spartans, the one, is being stressed even in the dialogue, even in the diction, the narrative boxes. All right. All right. Little verbal irony here, often another characteristic of Greek poetry. And this is where it gets pretty interesting. We get to see Leonidas negotiate directly with Xerxes, and again, we get that idea of logic versus reason. You can see that Xerxes is standing on the back of hundreds of slaves. He's almost drawn to look like the giant wolf over the little boy. He's decorated and adorned, where Leonidas wears a tattered cape from fighting. And what does Leonidas do? He hits him with the first strike. He draws first blood. He uses verbal irony, sarcasm. You must be Xerxes. And again, you have the gold of Xerxes, that decadent gold. You have the dark black. Again, in the art in the center of the page, it's like that crevice of the boy and the wolf. Xerxes is trying to make himself big. You notice his flowery language. He says, "Let us reason," but yet he tries to seduce him with words and threats. He compares himself to a god, claims to be God. Oftentimes, a lot of the gods are oftentimes considered, to be sometimes androgynous, sometimes bisexual in ways. And so you have this kind of creepy flirtation thing going on in the background with the crazy looking Xerxes there. And basically tries to seduce him, and with power, and it's just really interesting to pick apart, the language and look at the different ways the Spartans speak in comparison to the Persians is definitely worth noting. A whole paper could be written on that. So this is another one of the Greek epic storytelling traditions here, which is hubris, which it even mentions up there in the first. Leonidas is provoking Xerxes. How long will it be before your slaves fear my spears more than your whips? I should have brought our women down here to fight you, trying to poke fun at Xerxes' masculinity as well. That hyper masculinity, trying to draw him in, trying to goad him. And so that ends up what ends up being Xerxes' fall. So what he does is he sends his most powerful troops here, the Immortals, and they again notice black, silvers, and blues, and then the blood red and the Spartans. Again, Dionysian philosophy versus Apollonian philosophy. These Immortals are supposed to be immortal. They're not supposed to be able to be killed. The Spartans don't believe it. They say, hey, we'll put their name to the test. And so they tricked Xerxes into sending his most powerful forces when the Spartans are the freshest, ready to fight. They've only been fighting for like a day. It hadn't been like 3 or 4 days yet. They're not like exhausted. And so he sets a trap for them here. And again, we find out that the Immortals aren't that immortal after all, even though they're, supposed to be. So again, Apollonian philosophy wins out over superstition. And again, Xerxes is said to feel a very human chill crawl up his spine. You can see he's bit his lip and is bleeding a little bit. That foreshadows the blood at the end. And shows again that there are no gods here among the men. This guy's not a god, he's just a man. All right. So they're victorious. This page is worthy of noting because they get their hopes up a little bit, but Leonidas realizes that it can't end well. He already knows that they're going to die in battle, and that's the whole point of him coming out here. He's already planned it out. Now, I know that may sound cruel, and you're like thinking, oh, well, the Spartans died, but you got to realize the Spartans were like the Vikings. They believe that their only way, kind of into the glorious afterlife when you die is through death in battle. Kind of like the samurai and the Vikings, that was their goal, death in battle. So, it's not like he's tricking his guys or whatever. Anyways, you can see that Epheltes has lived, and he calls the gods are cruel because he's lived, and he completely shifts here, and we know that he's going to betray the Spartans because he abandons his cloak and stuff symbolically, clearly. All right, now notice the black in these splash pages. And chapter 5, the following chapter is called Victory. Black because of the death that is to come. And victory is kind of a funny word because, we know that King Leonidas and all his Spartans are killed. But they're still victorious, and we'll find out how next time on Dragon Ball Z. No, I'm just kidding. Just in a second, we'll find out how. So they're fighting. They're doing good. They're doing well. They're whooping butt. It's the second day. They're killing them. They're killing these giant beasts, these giant elephants. Xerxes is murdering his own generals when they fail and beheading them. And finally, Xerxes gets his way through, deception and, seduction. Here Epheltes gets all the things that he was never given: land, wealth, women, and a uniform inclusion that he's been wanting. As you can see, there's 2 naked women and naked Epheltes there. He's being seduced. He'll get everything. But he requires Epheltes to kneel before him as if he's a god, to betray, the Spartans, just, where he comes from. Okay? Now, this story within a story, I guess we're up to, I don't know, if you count Nefelti's backstory, I guess we're up to 7 or 8 stories within a story, which is another complex part of this comic book, how it's so structurally complex. You've got Dilios telling the story of Marathon. Now, that's important because symbolically it's going to be like history repeating itself. So at the Battle of Marathon, what happened was this is why we get Marathon. Xerxes' father, King Darius, Emperor Darius, had invaded Greece like 10, 20 years prior. I forget the exact years right now. I'm sorry. But they knew he was coming and they sent a runner. And the runner ran supposedly however many miles standard marathon is. Was it 22, 26? I don't know. I don't run. There's worse things. There's no worse thing than running. Anyways, so when the messenger got there, he told him that the Persians were invading and then dropped dead of exhaustion. And that gave the Greeks time to get their forces together. So when the Persians landed, they were already like attacking them as they got off the boats. And Darius got whipped up pretty bad and had to withdraw and retreat. And then Darius died. And then like 10, 20 years later, his son starts the invasion all over again. So that's why the battle of this story and then a story is important, because it kind of tells the future. And we find out that they've been betrayed. And again, you see the commitment that the Spartans have, and even a face-to-face and word-for-word comparison of the Arcadians versus the Spartans here on the bottom left. The way that the Spartans speak, the way that they behave, the way that they're drawn, all that stuff is depicted here in these panels and pictures. No retreat, no surrender. Of course, Dilios is sent, and this is where the victory comes into play. Leonidas already knows that they're going to die, so he sends Dilios, his storyteller, the one who's lost an eye, by the way, who's played by the same actor that played Faramir in Lord of the Rings, to go in and tell this story. And he knows that this story will inspire all the Greeks to join together to get, to fight the Persians, because even if King Leonidas died, that really inspires things. So he's the only one that goes, the only one who looks back, so it separates him from the Arcadians. Even though he's apart from the Spartans, he's still one of them. Right? Okay. Right. So you can see the, they really were betrayed, and all the people behind the Spartans got wiped out. You can see Epheltes starting to regret his actions. And here we have perspective from the point of view of Leonidas. We even get to see out of his helmet. And they're going to tie back in the story of the boy and the wolf here. As you notice, some of those colors are coming back as well. And again, you can compare the diction and the language that these Persians use, and you can just kind of smell the fake perfume and the BS coming off of it, and of course, you have the Spartans, All right, so again, we'll reference that language and the images from that original story. All right. There's a little deception here, and Leonidas proves that Xerxes is indeed not a god. And they even tie in the superstition here to the Spartans, because they say that they come from Heracles, which is Hercules. And, they're just covered in arrows. If you'll notice, the blood of the Spartans and the flesh of the Spartans and the earth of Greece, the tans and the reds start to run together in this artwork. He does get Xerxes. Xerxes ends up having to flee back to Persia after this, and eventually dies as empire collapses in real life, just so you know. Okay. And then we get, again, Dilios' narration here, remember us. Thousands of years, over 1,000 years from now, students from colleges are going to be walking on this land and remember us. That whole point of this tell, to keep these stories alive, the whole point of this. And then we have our big reveal that it is, in fact, 3 or 4 years later, Now we've got 10,000 Spartans and 30,000 Greeks. Dilios has been telling this story the whole time. So now we're back to our original storyline, the one you didn't know you were in. And this is the Battle of Plataea, and this is where the Spartans, 10,000 Spartans and 30,000 other Greeks from different city-states united, and they fought the Persians. They were up against about 130,000 Persians, and they just wiped the floor with them. I mean, because the Spartans were so amazing. You can imagine they were fighting 300 Spartans earlier, and now they're at like against 10,000. You know, it was just a slaughter. And that is how the book ends, you know, with that victorious coloring of all those Apollonian philosophies and Dionysian philosophies, and a sea of blood, a sea of Persian blood with the hot gates behind. So as you think about, you know, an essay for this comic, you know, you got ideas of hypermasculinity. You can talk about the military state. You know, you can be analyzing the art and the diction and how that contributes to these things. You know, how the diction is manly. You know, how the diction represents hypermasculinity along with the art. You could do an essay that analyzes the colors and what they represent in terms of, you know, Apollonian and Dionysian philosophy. You could write an entire essay on just the complex structure of this thing. You know, there's quite a number of things that you could do to write an essay, but I chose this comic book because it's fairly accessible. So even though it's complex, it's a good beginning one for those of you who haven't read any. And I hope you enjoyed it. Ladies, I know it was very, you know, kind of geared towards the guys, but I got some stuff coming up, I promise, don't worry. So there you go. All right, enjoy.